great network that has emerged. And I think if we were to find one person who has been responsible, either directly by mentoring many of us in this network, or indirectly by, inspiring with your work the issues of political economy and economic history in Latin America, that's obviously you. So this is really a treat for us. Welcome. Giorgio will be moderating the talk today. Everyone, I think, knows the rules, but I will just leave the floor to Giorgio and you from now on.
Okay. So thank you very much, James, for accepting our invitation. Just a couple of reminders. So there's going to be 40 minutes presentation where we will just allow clarifying questions that will need to be sent to me, so through the chat, and I will be filtering them. So I'm really choosing only clarifying question, and anything that is more like a question, a thorough question, will be asking the Q&A. So after this 40 minutes, we will open the Q&A. You should raise your hand if you want to ask a question to Jim, and we'll go in chronological order. We'll try to accommodate time as much as we can. So this is it. So James, thank you very much again for accepting this invitation. The floor is yours, and give us some hopes about the continent. And this will be very much in line with our seminar series. Thank you. I think you need to unmute yourself because you're.
Yes.
You are.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me, and thank you for those very kind words. So what I'm going to do today is talk about. Here we go. I'm going to talk about this paper, which is a joint with Jose Luis Falconi, and he's responsible for all the stuff on Peru in particular, as you'll see when we get going. So this is, I think this is something I've been struggling with, and Jose and I have been struggling with, and I've been struggling with other friends, which is to sort of try to rethink the political economy of Latin America. I'm not going to talk too much about the bigger agenda because I have even less to say on that than the small agenda, as you'll see. This is very much a kind of think piece with some examples, and which we think are interesting. But say, if you're going to say if you were going to say what the bigger agenda was in one sentence, the bigger agenda, my own personal agenda, is. Can I stop thinking about Latin America as a failed version of the United States? Can I start thinking of it as something different? If I was going to talk about the political economy of Africa, it would be impossible to think of it in those terms. If I was going to talk about the political economy of China or the Islamic State or the Middle East, it would make absolutely no sense to think of it as a failed version of the United States. It's clearly something different. But we're also used to think of Latin America as wanting to kind of be, have it, this particular type of society and always failing, and that's, I'd like to stop thinking like that. Okay, so that's the bigger agenda. So here, what are we talking about today? Well, the start of the paper, which would be very, very happy for feedback on the paper. I'm not going to talk about the start of the paper because otherwise I'll never get to the kind of newer bits. The start of the paper is just to sort of remind you of some of the syndromes of the political economy of underdevelopment, which most of us agree hold Latin America back and have held Latin America back for a long time because they're so persistent and path dependent. And in particular, it really focuses on this work that that Leopoldo and Carlos Molina and I have been doing about clientelism and state weakness in Colombia, how that leads to public good provision and a kind of lack of accountability and all the normal sort of things. So you could say, to use the terminology of why nations fail, why not? That's the usual story about extractive institutions. Latin America is held back by this kind of web of extractive institutions. Those are not good collectively, but they're held in place by kind of political incentives that we all understand. Okay, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to try to talk about, well, there's a lot of truth in that, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. And we've all been kind of on that road in some sense since, at least me personally, since I read, Engelman and Sokolov's staggeringly influential article 23 years ago, actually more than that, about 25 years ago when it came out as a working paper. But I just want to point out some problems with this view of the hegemony of extractive institutions, which I feel are very interesting, which we feel are very interesting. And that's really what the paper is about, kind of trying to illustrate problems with this view of the hegemony of extractive institutions. And to illustrate in lots of ways, there may be many spaces and there must be maybe much more room for maneuver in Latin America than is suggested by this discourse on extractive institutions. And the way I'm going to start by talking about that is to sort of back up and say, okay, we have this idea of a weak state. It's bad at raising resources. It's bad at regulating society. It's bad at providing public goods and order. But have we got exactly the right conceptualization of this state? And I'm going to argue no. And if you think, so I'm going to propose a different conceptualization of the state, which leaves a lot more room for non-extractive political projects. And I'm going to illustrate that with an example from Bolivia. Probably I'll just wave at this example from Colombia. I have a map and I can talk about it for 1 second, but another example from Colombia. Okay. So this alternative conception of the state, I think realistically allows for a lot more, as I say, room for maneuver for non-elite political projects, and much more inclusive and much less extractive political projects to germinate and even be successful. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example of that from Argentina, the unlikely case, you could say, of Peronism. Okay, so for me, and I think this is very much the understanding of the contemporary historians of Peronism. Peronism, was much more than a political coalition or political strategy. It was an identity. It emerged from society in a particular historical moment, and it came along with all sorts of cultural baggage and manifestations. And Peron, brilliantly harnessed that into a political movement. But we talk about that example to sort of show, where did these things come from? We're going to start talking about Bolivia, whatever, and these non-elite political movements. But I want to try to convince you that whatever Peronism was, whatever its long-run implications for Argentine development were, it was definitely a non-elite political movement that emerged from society in a way that existing elites were not able to control or repress or stop or whatever. Now, you could say, okay, that's fine, but there's a problem with Peronism. What's the fly in the ointment? Well, the problem is that Peronism was a very Manichaean identity. And, it was like them or us, and you're for me or against me, like Chavismo, So, and it reproduced many of the syndromes, which it fought against. You could say clientelism. Peronism became, extremely clientelistic. And so it just reproduced, in a kind of iron law of oligarchy way, the things that supposedly it had been fighting against in the 1940s and 1950s. But I don't think that has to be true. Okay, in the Bolivian case, we're going to show that I'm going to try to illustrate, that it's not true that what's emerged, with the MAS or the Cocaleros was a kind of super Manichaean identity. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about this emergence of this sort of Cholo identity in Peru over the last 20 or 30 years. Again, kind of non-elite, organic, coming from society, but also much more inclusive, not like Peronism. Okay, so at the end of the day, I think what we want to say is, how could you take this and be more optimistic about Latin America? Well, this kind of elite-dominated thing, that might be true in Guatemala, it might be true in Paraguay, but it's not true in lots of parts of Latin America. There's lots of space for very different types of politics and very different types of social movements and projects to emerge, and they can be a lot more inclusive. And I think that's what's so interesting about this Peruvian case and the Bolivian case. Maybe not Peronism, maybe not Chavismo, but I advance those just to show, how kind of dramatic revolutionary change is possible. Okay, so what about this business of kind of conceptualizing this weak Latin American state? Okay, and here's a picture from the paper with Leopoldo and Carlos that we talk about in the paper. I'm not going to talk about now. And I just show you this to say, on the left-hand side is the municipalities here, which are marked are the sample that we got data from. And the darker it is on the left, the left is tax evasion, on the right is clientelism. The darker it is, the more tax evasion there is and the more clientelism. So I'm not going to tell you how any of that's measured. You know what clientelism and tax evasion is. But you can see that this has a particular spatial pattern. You know, there's more clientelism and tax evasion on the Caribbean coast, in Sucre or Cordoba, in La Guajira, in Los Llanos, in Meta, for example. So there's a sort of core periphery structure to this, and I think that's going to be very relevant to this argument. And in some sense, the first person who pointed this out, at least when I paid any attention to it, was O'Donnell. O'Donnell wrote this famous paper where he sort of said, there are all these brown areas in Latin America. I don't know why he used the color brown, but the point was there's all these sort of ungoverned spaces. There's a sort of fiction that the state rules the country or runs the country, but actually there's large ungoverned spaces in Latin America, what you call brown areas. And I think for us, the most interesting kind of account of this is this book, The Lettered City, by Angel Rama, who's not a social scientist, but it's a book about the history of the Latin American state. And I think we've got into this mode of thinking about elites and reproduction of elites and Engelman and Sokolov, and that's all good. But like what he points out is that that's true, but Latin American states have always had this very utopian aspect to them. Okay, so he points out that the origins of the state in colonial Latin America, it was this extremely kind of utopian project where what he emphasizes the kind of like the way in which there's a disconnect between what actually happened and reality, or what he calls the emphasis on potential over reality. This is something which I've experienced so many times, especially in Colombia, this kind of disconnect between what people say is happening and what's going to happen and what is actually happening and could ever possibly happen. Okay, so he traces this sort of intellectually back to the colonial period, and the notion that somehow this colonial project, very much in the period of the Enlightenment, and it sort of transposed all these utopian designs. Thomas More's Utopia, when was that written? At exactly the time of the expansion into the Americas, and it was a kind of world freed from what he says like ordinary circumstances. Okay, so here's a great Colombian example. There's going to be too many Colombian examples. I apologize for that. Very recent, which I kind of experienced firsthand, so to speak, which is El Bronx. So here's El Bronx for the non-Colombians in the audience. Here's the presidential palace. Here's the Plaza de Bolívar, and here's El Bronx, just down the road. So the President Duque can nip out and buy some whatever you buy in El Bronx. Anyway, so this is a den of iniquity and vice and criminal activities, as you can see, just around the corner from the presidential palace. But it's in this beautiful thing, which is Bogota. Just look at it. In fact, here's, Rama points out, Bogota is like the prime example of a kind of utopian design. There's all these wonderful, it's also orderly, isn't it? Colombia, hasn't it struck you how orderly it is? Look at these wonderful calles and carreras. They're all numbered. They're laid out in this perfect grid. Even El Bronx, you see, it's almost like a perfect square, But what he points out is that time and time again, there's a sort of clash between somehow the people who run these countries, like Alcalde Peñalosa, sort of think that the city is actually the same as this utopian conception of it. So the letrados are the people that Rama describes as, kind of conceiving of this utopian vision. Only letrados like Peñalosa, Senor Peñalosa, a great example, could envisage an urban ideal after the construction of the city, preserving their idealized vision in a constant struggle with the material modifications introduced by the daily life of the city's ordinary inhabitants. So here's the constant struggle on the left. And indeed, after El Bronx was cleared out, you can see the police and soldiers here clearing it out. What happens? Bogota police sweep addicts out of Bronx and into the Plaza de España. It just moves somewhere else. Actually, my colleague Chris Blattman even has a kind of econometric paper on this. You clamp down on it and it moves somewhere else. Okay. There's an older version, by Ernesto Chagrodsky and Sebastian Galliani and Rafael Di Tella in Buenos Aires. They may not think of it like this, but it kind of moves somewhere else, and the thing is preserved. Why is that? Because there's a sort of equilibrium here, and there's a disequilibrium between one's conception of how the city should be and how it actually how it actually is. Okay, so there's this element of an illusion of control. Okay, so I, what we do in the article is to sort of use this, which you might find a little outrageous, as a way of kind of saying, this, a lot of the control of elites over society, yeah, it's there. Salinas de Gortari did privatize Telmex to Carlos Slim, but a lot of the control is illusory. Okay, and here's the Colombian example. Colombian elites did not want Colombia to turn into the drug-running, kidnapping, and homicide capital of the world. They just couldn't do anything about it, because they don't exercise control over large parts of the country, except in their imagination, even just around the corner from the presidential palace. So to think about the state and the way the state works, you have to think about, well, how does that work then? There's bits, there's these utopian bits, where there's people kind of out of touch with reality, thinking they govern these vacant spaces. And how does that governance actually work? Well, I think that's where the clientelism and the negotiation comes in. And here's an example of one of many one could cite. Again, it's Colombian. So let me tell you the story of John Calzones. John Calzones. So he started out as a local businessman in Yopal, in Los Llanos, and he's called Calzones because he made money selling ladies' underwear. So he started up some ladies' underwear shops. He made money. Okay. So then what did he do? Well, Yopal is a place which lacks electricity and running water, even though it's a departmental capital. So he provided it. He took over some land which had been confiscated from two paramilitaries. And he started to build a ciudadela, La Bendición. He flattened it. He put in electricity. He put in sewage, water, and then he subsidized people to start building houses. He gave out thousands of lots to people with all this infrastructure, all the kind of infrastructure and public services that the Colombian government doesn't provide in Yopal, and he got people, he subsidized people, okay? He created a social base, a bit like Peron, actually, So he created a social base, and then what did he do? He ran for office, okay? Movimiento Social La Bendición, no más corrupción, good slogan in Colombia, there he is. And, so he turned it into a kind of social movement. And what did he do? He ran for mayor of Yopal. So if you look at how this ungoverned periphery is governed, it's governed by harnessing local initiative, like this gentleman here. All over Colombia, people mobilize, they provide public goods, they develop a base, a social base, they run for politics, and then the people in Bogota negotiate with them. They kind of say, okay, this guy looks good, we can work with him, deliver some votes and we'll give you some money and you can build another barrio. So it's a very pragmatic kind of negotiation. Here's another, pragmatic negotiation in Colombia, which is, who are these gentlemen here? Well, this is Ramon Izaza on the right. This is Mancuso, Salvatore Mancuso, and this is Ernesto Baez on the left. So these are three paramilitary warlords sitting in Congress, talking about their political project with suits on, and well, what is this? It's the same thing. It's a little bit more militarized than John Calzones, but it's the guys who kind of mobilize, they get armed in the periphery. The Colombian government can't do anything about it, but then it negotiates with them. It gets them to do stuff and provide public goods, or, it outsources assassinations or limpieza social or whatever, but it's same thing, just a little bit more out of control and militarized. Okay, so if that's your image, so there's a lot of heterogeneity here, which I can't possibly do any justice to. And I'm going to give a Bolivian example. Of course, the Bolivian periphery looks a lot different from the Colombian periphery, which is good news for the Bolivians. But here's a sort of image, which comes from CLR James's book about the Haitian Revolution, the Black Jacobins. If any of you have ever read it, So he's quoting the Marquis de Mirabeau. Mirabeau indeed said that the colonists in Haiti, the white colonists, slept on the edge of Vesuvius. But for centuries, the same thing has been said, and the slaves had never done anything. So we don't know when this Vesuvius will explode, but it probably will explode at some point, and in a sort of collective way. So I think when just these examples of John Calzones and these paramilitary commandantes in the Colombian Congress sort of suggest gosh, whatever's going on out there, you know, in Yopal or the Magdalena Medio or Montes de Maria, like the people in Bogota really don't have much control over it. Okay, so there's large ungoverned areas, and you know, okay, not everywhere is like Colombia, but quite a lot of places are like Colombia. Okay, so where non-elite political projects can germinate. So if you think about the Colombian case, you know, the main non-elite political project which germinated, you could say, would be the guerrilla, you know, and the kind of legacy of the Cuban Revolution. So that's, you know, that's not exactly what I have in mind or what we have in mind here. So let me talk about another one of a kind of political project germinating in this ungoverned spaces outside the lettered city, which is the rise of the cocaleros. So you know, so here's the this red line here is the mass vote share. So from the mid-1990s, you know, mass more or less didn't exist. The movement towards socialism, it started out as a movement of trade unionists growing coca. Okay, and the cocaleros formed a political party. They formed a coalition with a lot of other groups, including a lot of indigenous groups who are extremely organized. And then they entered politics. Why did they enter politics? Well, you know, here's one of the reasons they got so organized and entered politics was there was an enormous ramp up of anti-narcotics activities during the Banzer government. In fact, the United States persuaded General Banzer to adopt a policy of zero coca. So this was a sort of staggering violation in some sense of the equilibrium such as it was in Bolivian society. So I think a lot of this equilibrium, you know, between the core and periphery, you could say, is a kind of equilibrium where there are rules and there's norms, and you know, part of the norm is, you know, you don't mess with each other. You know, you don't mess with the center doesn't mess with the periphery. You kind of negotiate and exchange. But the zero coca was a massive violation of the social contract, or what we say in the paper, the moral economy of the IU. So this is, you know, inspired by E.P. Thompson, the British historian's notion of like how local society functioned in early modern Britain. He said there was a kind of moral economy, and the moral economy was a set of norms and social practices which were kind of outside the scope of the national state in London, and which the national state really couldn't mess with. The local institutions were run by, you know, by local people, the justices of the peace, the police, you know, the commissioners of the poor law. These were all local people who were chosen, you know, by lot, and who enforced these norms. And Thompson pointed out that a lot of the problems, you know, disturbances in early modern England were caused when the state sort of challenged this moral economy. And so that's how one could think about this. You know, the origins of the mass, the origins of this kind of political reaction and the capture of the state in 2005 is an enormous reaction of the sort Thompson described in England of a violation of this moral economy, because coca, you know, coca is just so kind of, it's so involved in all the practices of indigenous society in Bolivia, but who would have known that in La Paz? You know, so this is a fantastic example in some sense. Like, why on earth would Banzer adopt such a policy? But because he just was out of touch with the country he was governing. Okay, so but what's the consequence of this? You know, well, you know, here's the moral economy. Here's the moral economy in action in the IU. You know, the IU. I haven't talked about the details of this. You know, but the cocaleros, of course, were an interesting. That was a mixture of all sorts of people who went, you know, into the Chapare Valley to grow coca or whatever. But when they form a coalition with indigenous people, they're able to tap into this staggeringly organized indigenous society. So this, you know, when I said, you know, the Bolivian periphery doesn't look like the Colombian periphery, that's because there's all of these indigenous people who are incredibly organized. So this is the officials of IU in Oruro, in Orinoco. And, you know, you can see the officials of the IU. I'm not an official of the IU, but there they are. You know, and this is I can't talk about it, but this is the IU is a fabulous institution. You can see that all the official positions are paired men and women. So it's very inclusive in a gender sense also. It's not just inclusive socially. And of course, there's a dense web of reciprocity and institutions and ability to kind of enforce rules, judicial collective action. So this was a, this was a kind of time bomb waiting to go off in some sense for the people in La Paz, but it took a particular set of events to trigger this. Okay, so but we're saying here this is the Bolivians were sleeping on a volcano, but it was a much more inclusive volcano than in Yopal. And here's some evidence from inelegantly scanned from the World Bank webpage, which is, I'm just checking, okay, which is what happened to inequality in Bolivia since Morales came to power. It's rather staggering, actually. I know inequality's fallen in Peru and lots of parts of Latin America, even Chile, in the last 20 years. So this, I'm not testing hypothesis here. I'm just saying, we have other evidence about the impact of this on social mobility, which I'm not going to talk about. But here's just a sort of sliver of evidence. At least this is consistent. This is a staggering fall in the Gini coefficient. From about 0.6 down to about 0.42 during this period of the hegemony of the Morales government. So here's a movement that germinated in the periphery, a much more inclusive movement, and it's captured the central state and delivered enormous improvements, particularly for indigenous people. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Afro-Colombian land rights, but this is actually also a fantastic triumph of inclusion in the Colombian Pacific, that Afro-Colombian people who were kind of finally recognized as existing in the 1991 constitution were able to establish collective property rights for huge swaths of the Pacific. You see all this purple bit in the right-hand side map. So how did they do that? It's a story of the lettered city. It's a story of the inability of elites to kind of understand and control and manage the process. Okay, so, all right. So, oops. Okay, so there's two examples. Sketched very rapidly, just to illustrate. There's a lot going on here other than elite-dominated extractive institutions. Okay, and I think I want to say even that's the right way to think about Peronism. Like what was I always I'm always struck by how much more hierarchical Colombia is as a society than Argentina. And so, one natural hypothesis, there's many hypotheses for that, could be historical migration, investment in education. But one hypothesis is that, this really is a fruit of Peronism. This is a fruit of the descamisados. If you read what Peron said, he endlessly emphasized this egalitarian kind of anti-elite rhetoric. And I think I think there's a lot of, if you look at the details of policy, then what he did is in many ways consistent with that. What he did is very complicated, but he also pushed labor reform. And the evidence that I can find, which comes from Facundo Alvarez, is Peronism, again, there's lots of confounders, did coincide with very large falls in inequality. So this is Facundo Alvarez's data on the top income shares in Argentina from the mid-1940s. There's a lot of missing observations and gaps in the data, but this is at least certainly consistent with the idea that Peronist policies led to very large falls in inequality. I think that, this is one of the photographs that Peronist historians or Argentine historians love, to show, which is the famous invasion of the descamisados of the Plaza Mayo, after when Peron was imprisoned in 1945 in the military, when he fell out with the rest of the people in the junta. And, this is used to show Peronism really was a social revolution. These guys are wearing shirts, but they're doing something very naughty and uncivilized, which any real porteño would never do. They're washing their feet, in the fountains of the Plaza de Mayo, which don't do that, Giorgio, if you're in Buenos Aires. Okay, so that's a no-no. All right, so but.
Jim, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Just a reminder, you have 10 minutes left.
10 minutes. Okay, that's good. Yeah. But I want to say, we want to say in the paper also, think about this. This is an ideology. Like, why has Peronism been so persistent in Argentina? Because it's more than just a political coalition or a political strategy. It's an idea. It's an identity. It came out of society. That's very much the emphasis of the historians of Peronism nowadays. And so it was molded into a political project, but it's an identity. It came out of society. It was a non-elite identity. It was a very popular identity in many ways. It used lots of popular elements of culture, and it took over the state. It captured the state. Okay, and I think we think that's very interesting. Okay, so sure, these are very Manichean identities, but let me show you another non-Manichean. Oh, what am I doing here? No, I'm not going to be able to do this properly. What do I do? I stopped sharing, but I messed it up, I think.
Yeah, we can still see your slides.
Okay, so okay. Share file. No. How do I stop sharing? I wanted to stop sharing. Stop sharing. Okay. All right. Gosh, how incompetent. Sorry. All right. Let's. Oh, man. Sorry. I had this all set up and now it disappeared. Okay. All right. We're getting there. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Can you see me? No. Can you see this? Can you see the bit?
We can see YouTube, yes.
Por el solo hecho de ser peruano,
You can see it. Okay.
tiene derecho a gozar de lo maravilloso que es ser peruano. Perú, Nebraska, 569 habitantes, un grifo, un restaurante, una avenida, un banco, un museo, una estación de tren que, bueno, ahora sirve para otros fines, su escuela, su tanque de agua, su alcaldía y un sheriff cuyo último trabajo fue separar a un perro de un gato en 1998. Perú, Nebraska, tiene un problema. Son peruanos, pero no saben qué significa serlo.
Listo, muchachos, llegamos. Vamos, Cristian. Vamos, dale.
Probando. Nuestra misión, ser embajadores de nuestro país y leerles sus derechos como peruanos. Ustedes son de Perú. Tienen derecho a comer rico.
Okay, I think. No, hold on. All right, so you got the idea. I won't. They're Peruvians in Peru, Nebraska, but they don't know what that means. They don't. Can you hear me? Yeah, they don't know what that means. They don't know what that means to be a Peruvian. Okay, so what does it mean to be a Peruvian? Well, everyone has the right to eat well. What an odd thing. But I think like what we try to say at the end of the paper is to say, like, talk about non-elite, social change in society. A fantastically interesting example is this notion of this emergence of you could say this Cholo identity in Peru, and the emergence of Peruvian cuisine. What is that? It's the perfect example of a kind of mestizaje of many different sorts of cuisine: Andean cuisine, Western cuisine, Asian cuisine. It's a kind of economic model. It's a cultural and social phenomena that's kind of spread around the world, but it reflects a very different type of society emerging in Peru. It's interesting that I read something that Jose sent me about Peru recently, and it uses this expression about talking about Odebrecht, that the fish rots from the head down. But I guess what we're saying is that's completely the wrong way to think about what's gone on in Peru. What's gone on in Peru is, yeah, there are these corrupt presidents and Odebrecht and stuff like that. But don't fixate on that. Fixate on the underlying social change that's been going on, that's creating an extremely different type of society, which is radically different from this kind of old elite, non-elite type of society that we try to think about, that we often think about in this political economy of Latin America. Okay, so this is more like a French annales kind of way of thinking about, focus on the underlying sort of slow-moving social structure, and then you see something super different in Peru. So, can I show you some data on that? Well, I don't know if this counts as data, but back in 1986, Alan Garcia, when he was the late Alan Garcia, when he was president, he brought together what people called the 12 apostles, which were like the 12 biggest business oligarchs, to kind of back his plan, to the extent he had a plan. And you can see what's interesting of these. Here's the list on the left, 1986. All of these people, where were they from? They were limeño elites, like many of them, traditional families, businesses going back to the 19th century. There's a recent update of this by a Peruvian sociologist, and here's the new apostles on the right. And look at the change between 1986 and 2020. Okay, some of them are there. The Benavides are still there, the Brecias are still there, the Romeros are still there, but half of them are now from the provinces, from Cajamarca, from Ayacucho, from Arequipe. There's a whole new class of business elites, and I pulled from the web the photos of these people, and what's really interesting is you see just without, I'm not going to talk about who's Cholo and who's not Cholo because I'm not Peruvian enough to understand how to use that word appropriately. But you can see that this is just a much more diverse set of people than if I'd had the photographs in 1986. Okay, so that we think that we think is interesting. So what are we saying here? We're trying to say, look, this extractive stuff, that's okay, but there's a lot of stuff it's not capturing. There's a lot of space, there's a lot of potential for very different kind of inclusive projects to germinate. Here's some examples. I think the Bolivian case is an example of that. I think what's been going on in Peru, is an example of that. And it's a bit like China. If you looked for corruption and all sorts of dysfunctionality in China, you could certainly find it. But underneath that, there's a society which in many ways is very organized and consistent with prosperity, focused with norms of meritocracy and bureaucracy. And so in the Chinese case, if you just focused on Odebrecht, the Chinese, I know Odebrecht didn't get to China, but if they had got to China, you could focus on that and you'd sort of think, oh gosh, the fish rots from the head down. But if you ignored that and thought of that as noise and focused on the kind of underlying more sociological aspects of China, then you see something different. And I think that Peruvian case is like that. That's maybe a very Peruvian argument. You don't see anything like Cholo identity in Colombia. It's not relevant in other parts of Latin America. It's just an example of, are we looking in the wrong place? We endlessly have these intuitions about we can solve these problems, if we can just get the institutions right, or we can do randomized audits, with all respect to my former students and all this other stuff. And but this is saying, can we look somewhere different? Can we look at other forces or use other instruments to think about how different political coalitions or forces might emerge? And I think just this, one could talk about other examples. We talk a little bit about the Mexican Revolution in the paper. I'm not going to talk about that now. This is a very different model. This model of Cholo, the Cholo identity. It's a very different way of thinking about society than you have in the United States, and I also find that very interesting. But let me shut up and answer questions. I think I probably said enough to give people a sense of what the paper is about.
So thank you very much, Jim. Now we're gonna open the floor for questions. So if you have anything you would like to ask Jim, now is the time, and I ask you to kindly raise your hand, which is the button you should see on the right part of your screen. So please let me know. Okay. So I see Alberto Sinfer have a question. So if we can unmute him, that would be very nice. Alberto,
Hello?
now you're... Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Jim, this is fascinating. One question. So one thing that emerges from this, in my view, is that, well, you're moving away from the incentives that institutions provide and the structure that institutions provide. So my question is, what are you really saying? Are you really saying that you know, culture and informal norms and all that become important precisely because those places and the vast areas are ungoverned and therefore have no institution, have an institutional vacuum? Or are you saying that they always matter and the force of culture and informal norms actually competes with a force of formal institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say, you know, they're ungoverned by elites, but they have, you know, like if you thought about this example of the Ayu from Bolivia, you know, that's heavily institutionalized. You know, so there's enormously dense social norms and regulations, and so, you know, a lot of it may be informal in that Northian terminology, but it's just as real. It's just that, you know, it's outside the scope of the control of the central state. You know, I mean, that of course is something much more deeply rooted in history than what you see in the Colombian, you know, countryside. But I, you know, so they're sort of pluralistic in that, you know, the sort of institutional pluralism, perhaps that's the way to talk about it. You know, there's very different institutional orders, and one of it is this kind of extractive Carlos Slim type of order, but there's other orders, you know, and that must be completely true in Mexico, you know, you know, as true as it is in Bolivia and large parts of certainly southern Mexico. So I, you know, that, I guess that's what I'm saying. You know, I don't know it's about culture. I don't use the word culture very often, as you know. I'm happy with informal institutions.
Okay, thank you, Alberto. Now the next in line is Claudio Ferraz, if we can unmute him. And please, Claudio, feel free to ask your question. Now we should be able to hear you.
Okay. Hi, Jim. Super interesting. Great to see you now becoming a sociologist, not only an economist and political scientist. No, I think it's super interesting. Should we think, I mean, a lot of these changes, I think, and definitely Peru is only one of them, but they seem to be happening in Latin America. I mean, the inequality decreased for a decade everywhere, right? Like in across different countries, like Brazil, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Ecuador. I mean, it's really like a widespread phenomena. But at the same time, so that's on one side, and on the other side, the whole, I think it's super interesting to think about the Peruvian example, but it's still kind of coordinated by the elite, right? So if you think about where the gastronomy revolution starts, is really with this guy Gaston Arcurio, which is, I mean, he is still part of the elite, right? It's just that maybe it's a more innovative elite. They have a different vision for the country, right? So should we think that we need to be lucky to have kind of like the right elite combined with some sort of redistribution to shift an equilibrium and open up space for kind of like new groups and new political entrepreneurs? Like how should we think about this?
Yeah. I mean, you're right that inequality's fallen everywhere, but you've seen my regressions on social mobility in Bolivia, you know, so that I think there's, you know, there's some evidence that this is you know, that there's real kind of change in mobility and inequality, which is connected to the rise of the mass. You know, I think the Arcurio, he's like the kind of Peron of Peruvian cuisine, isn't he? He's just sort of harnessing, you know, all of this other stuff that's going on. He's a kind of entrepreneur, you know, he's a sort of cultural entrepreneur, if you like. Oh, I use that word, but you know, I guess we want to emphasize that this cuisine, it is this sort of mestizaje. It's coming out of this kind of real mixtures of people and ideas and cultures and histories and, you know, and languages and so that's a very inclusive thing. Yeah, he's, you know, he's an elite or whatever, but I think, you know, lots of other people are being pulled along in that wave. Of course, you know, there's still, you know, you see what's going on in Peru now with COVID-19. You know, there's still problems with having a vacuum, you know, of state services in peripheral Lima in terms of access to health, and that's a sort of complete disaster. So So this is, this is a work in progress. I guess we're not advertising this as like being some staggering success. It's very much a work in progress. But so I those inequality trends may be there, but I think, I think it's just these social trends we find very interesting. I don't know whether you always need, leadership or entrepreneurship or political or economic or social, I guess, to sort of gel these things into something, into a political movement, but I think it's that we're talking about the kind of the elements that are there to be orchestrated by political entrepreneurs, I guess.
Claudio, I don't know whether you raise your hand again, if you want to follow up a bit, but if not, I have another question. Okay, can we unmute Claudio a bit, just to be sure that is Claudio, are you there?
No, I just wanted a quick compliment. So one thing, I mean, I'm not observing a lot what's happening in terms of like society at the local level, but one thing that emerged in a very interesting way in Brazil with the COVID was a lot of local movements in the favelas, in the slum, organizing to get like food to people and organize in ways where the state was not reaching, right? On the one hand, you do have like kind of organized crime reaching that space, but you also have a lot of super organized local level movements occupying also that space. And that's an example of like these local entrepreneurs that once they have a hole there, they're feeling the space that the state is not feeling, and that can generate future leaders in next elections, whatever. So I think there are these interesting dynamics.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Then thank you, Claudio. The next in line is Juan Camilo Cárdenas. So if we can unmute him. Okay, Juan Camilo, we can hear you now. So let's go.
Yes, Jim, hi. It's good to hear you and continuing hearing you about these explorations. It's always stimulating. I was wondering about the bottom-up social movements that you described with more examples with the indigenous case. You mentioned the case of the Afro-Colombian movement for getting recognition to land titling, but I want to go further in the case of Blacks in Latin America as compared to indigenous in the growing of participation in creating other elites. What's your take on how the Black population in Latin America being huge, if we come back to slavery, the vast majority of slaves came to Latin America as opposed to North America. And yet you don't see much of these explorations of Blacks getting into the newer elites, into the newer access to economic or political elites. Do you have something in mind on what is happening in terms of the invisibility of Blacks and Black leadership as opposed to indigenous in your case?
I don't know. That's a great question, but I'm not sure I know enough about the topic to answer it. You tell me. I mean, I've witnessed myself, just in Colombia, since I started going to Colombia, when black people didn't exist in Colombia, and now they do exist. And that's been a remarkable transformation, in the last 30 years. But I'm not sure I know enough about the facts elsewhere, honestly, to be able to comment on that. I guess Brazil would be the place where that was, of a huge order of magnitude. But I'm honestly not sure I understand enough about that topic. That's something that, that's something for us to study, I guess.
Great. So I don't see any other question, but if you have the question, now is the time to raise your hand.
So Giorgio, I think you are missing some people who asked through the Q&A.
Oh,
okay. So unfortunately, please try to raise your hand rather than use the Q&A so that Giorgio doesn't have to look at several windows. And I think we have Julian Gomez and then Rashid. And I also raised my hand, but let's allow the participants to go first.
Okay, so let's unmute Julian Gomez then. Let's see. So so perhaps there is a bit of a problem. The question from Julian was, is the okay? So that we can skip it. So Rashid, can we unmute Rashid? Yeah, please go on.
Can you hear me?
Hello? You can talk now, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Jim, for this very nice, thought-provoking presentation. So I'm wondering whether the argument is there is this underlying force that is perhaps less observable than what's happening really in the elite, who have the illusion of dominating, but they are not really what's affecting it. But is the argument that this underlying force really becomes influential when it gets to power, as it is the case in Bolivia, in the Evo Morales, as you are showing, at some point that they get into power, and that's where it really becomes influential? Or even if it doesn't get into the central power, a lot of what's happening is the well-being of individuals, the effects of inequality are there anyway, whether it gets into the central power or not. Because we see that inequality goes down when they actually get into power. So you kind of state both in the same presentation.
Yeah, I don't think this equilibrium, this sort of lettered city equilibrium has been great for Latin America. I think it allows elites to, exploit all sorts of things, create monopolies and preferential access to all sorts of things. It leads to kind of massive under-provision of public goods in the periphery. So I think, that's why it's important to capture the state in some sense, because otherwise, your access to resources are limited, and your ability to influence the national political system, is very limited. And so I think that's. I don't think the initial, the initial equilibrium that E.P. Thompson was talking about in early modern England was a much more kind of functional one. But I think it's not so functional. If you go to these places in rural Bolivia or whatever, there's no state functionaries. There's very few public goods. Now there might be electricity because Evo Morales, they stuck electricity up all over the place. But they're bereft of what we'd think of as essential public goods. So I'm not saying that initial situation is advantageous collectively, or even for the people in the periphery. I'm just saying it's of a nature which allows for a lot more possibility, I think, than this kind of extractive narrative would suggest. I guess that's the main point. We're trying to illustrate there's all sorts of, just this very lack of control creates all sorts of potential, the sleeping on Vesuvius, as C.L.R. James said it.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's try. We have two questions from Diego Astorga and Pablo Querubin. Perhaps we're taking back to back, and then Jim, you can reply because we're actually going out of time. So if Diego Astorga can be unmuted, that would be nice.
Hello, very interesting, thank you. I just wanted to know your opinions about whether social media can foster the development of new political movements differentially from the typical elites, basically. And thanks.
Okay, so let us take the next question as well. Pablo Querubin, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, so this is, Jim, this is super interesting. And I just wanted to make a comment related to what Claudio mentioned about the role of gangs, which is, I keep thinking about what's the equivalent for Colombia of all of this beyond the examples of, the Afro-Colombian or indigenous communities. And you alluded to this earlier, but I think that the illegal drug culture is somewhat related to this, in the sense that it was very disruptive to the elites. It provided a vehicle for upward mobility and for wealth accumulation for lots of people in places in which they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do it. And you do see it as a threat to some extent to a lot of members of the elite. So, and I don't think it created a political movement openly about this, but it certainly had implications for the political equilibrium. So I don't know to what extent you think that, the way in which the drug culture and the culture of easy money in Colombia, fits into this narrative about like a disruptive anti-elite movements?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. You know, if you thought about the history of English capitalism, you know, there's a lot of English people made a fortune, you know, selling. They made a fortune slave raiding and slave trading as well. So there was all sorts of highly, you know, dubious economic activities led to upward social mobility and social change in England. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's, you know, my general view, I guess, would be the drug industry in Colombia was more like John Calzone's. You know, it was kind of negotiated with. Let's not forget that Pablo Escobar ended up as a suplente on a liberal list to Congress. You know, why did he do what? How did that happen? That's the same thing. It's the negotiation. You know, so that they were sort of contained. You know, in this. They were contained, you know. When Pablo Escobar couldn't be contained, he had to be got rid of, you know. I don't know. I'd have to think more about that, but I guess you know, it's sort of in Colombia. You haven't seen this germination of a kind of larger project, you know, with a sort of transformative potential in the way that you've seen in Bolivia, or maybe you're seeing in Peru, or you know, why is that? Well, I think that's a complicated, you know, historical process. Obviously, indigenous people are interesting here, right? Because indigenous people are enormously organized, and they have, you know, huge kind of collective resources that frontier campesino society in Colombia doesn't really have. It doesn't have that social capital in the same way, you know, Aymara Ayus does. You know, I would say in terms of social media, well, Leopoldo has a great paper about this. Leopoldo and Carlos Molina have a great paper, The Natural Experiment on the Spread of Facebook, you know, which I recommend if you're interested in the connection between social media and collective action. So certainly there's some well-identified evidence on this topic. I don't know. I mean, you know, my view of all of these things, technology, you know, technological innovation, you know, it's all about the kind of interaction with the initial equilibrium. You know, these things can be good, but it all depends on how they're used, and, you know, and in what context, and who has access to them. So I don't think I have a clear. I only have a very complicated conditional answer to that. You know, if you thought about the academic literature, think about the political economy literature, the impact of like radio. You know, you've got David Stromberg's paper about the 1930s in the US. You know, you've got Ruben Enikolopov and Maria Petrova's paper about Hitler. You know, you've got David Yamagasawa's Drot's radio paper about the Rwandan genocide. You know, there's just terrific heterogeneity from a kind of a particular technology doesn't really have any consequences. It has very conditional consequences. I guess Leopoldo was estimating the average effect, and that's pretty interesting to know the answer to that. But I'm not sure. So his results would say, you know, that's good for collective action, and it's good for, I guess it's good for fostering a more inclusive equilibrium in Latin America. Is that the right conclusion, Leopoldo?
Yeah, well, we try to be a bit cautious on the welfare effects, but we can definitely say that it increases.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great. So we have time perhaps for the last two questions, since we started a little bit late. Diego Aicinena, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly. And then Leopoldo, there are no more people on the waiting list. Okay, Diego, please ask your question.
Thank you, Jim. Very interesting. Quick question. So your story is a story about optimism towards, you know, greater inclusiveness or moving towards a more inclusive equilibrium. But you mentioned some counterexamples, Guatemala and Paraguay, if I recall correctly. So some of these counterexamples may have to do with elites, perhaps. Well, or you can think of it, traditional and non-traditional elites colluding to keep an exclusionary zone outside non-elites. So how does that prevent from happening in other places, or how do you prevent elites, including non-traditional elites, to essentially colluding and keeping exclusions on the rest of society?
Yeah, I mean, those examples, you know, I sort of threw those out. I mean, Paraguay is actually interesting. You know, like Paraguay is the one Latin American country where, you know, white people speak indigenous language. Everyone speaks Guarani in Paraguay. It's absolutely fascinating. I don't know the history of that, but that is, people. That's not true that everyone speaks Quechua in Peru, or Aymara, whatever in El Alto. So that's a sort of fascinating fact about Paraguay. I just feel, if you've been to Paraguay, is a very unmodernized place, and it still suffers from many of kind of much more deeply rooted extractive institutions even than anywhere else I've ever been in Latin America. So and I think Guatemala has such a history of kind of extractive institutions and violence and exploitation that I guess that just seems like very challenging to imagine that happening. But you're right. You're right that will stop happening. The Spanish colonial authorities run Latin America. Well, they ran it indirectly through indigenous leaders. And in fact, if you ever looked at it in detail at a grant of encomienda, which sort of divided the rents, between, sort of described how much stuff the Spaniards were going to get, how much labor they'd get, and how much resources or whatever. The cacique, or was always getting stuff too. The priests were getting stuff. The encomendero was getting stuff, but the cacique was getting stuff too. So the caciques were given a kind of vested interest in this system. So sure that could happen again, but that could happen, and maybe it has happened. It has happened in the past. But I think like the thing about Colombia, for example, is it's just much too unstable to kind of have relationships like that. Everything is continually negotiated and renegotiated. As Pablo was saying, there's just a lot of sort of social mobility in this periphery in Colombia. And I think if you take the Bolivian case, my impression is that it's very hard to kind of corrupt these institutions because there's just so much kind of accountability and so much control over these local institutions of the IU or the whatever. Like it's just there's a lot of accountability and representation. So there's institutionality which makes it difficult to capture. And in Colombia, you don't really know who to capture. So I'm sure that incentive is there, but.
Leopoldo, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, if we can keep Jim a couple of more minutes, we're already a bit late. But I just wanted to make a short comment, because I think that this idea that on the margins where the state is less present, there is this space for non-elite political projects to emerge and breathe. I think their examples are fascinating, and the talk was very illustrative on that. I guess the really challenging question that I think it's key in this whole story is what determines what happens in the relationship between these groups and the state, right? So on the one hand, I think of examples much like what I think I mentioned this before to you, Jim, Julieta Lemetre's work on Colombia in her book, the state always arrives late. People solve their problems, there is political leadership in these margins, and then the state arrives with some solutions that are completely dysfunctional for these groups, and then there's some tension and they cannot almost work together because the solutions that the people have come up with are just inconsistent with what the state has for them. Then another possibility, which I perhaps think is what happens in examples like the Chavismo example that you mentioned, is that these groups are successful, but they then tap into the existing extractive powers of the state that they were fighting against. And they become yet another kind of extractive group, and it's not like much hope for optimism there. Then the other example is like the drug industry in Colombia, which perhaps is one in which you get this bargaining and you get co-opted, and that's essentially what happens. So I think that the successful stories are those where there are spaces actually in the state where these groups can tap into and use it to their own advantage, but not in a kind of extractive way. And so I think that the black movements in Colombia are a nice example of that, because much of their struggles have been outside and in the margins of the state, but they also kind of enthusiastic and actively use the constitution to do stuff that they want to. So I think that I see all of these kind of roads, and I guess the question is, it would be really interesting to have kind of a comparative theory, what would take you toward one road or another, right? So I don't know if this is maybe not a question, just a comment, but I just kept thinking about this second step when you were sharing all these very interesting examples.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You're sort of alluding to what Daron and I call the iron law of oligarchy. In Why Nations Fail. That there is this element of, there's a very interesting book called We Elected Chavez, which is by this anthropologist and political scientist about kind of collective organization in like poor areas in poor barrios in Caracas, and how they say we created Chavez, we elected him, it's sort of this very bottom-up element of it. But then, as you say, it kind of takes on all of the kind of bad characteristics of the previous regime, kind of system of, very clientelistic, and that they were fighting against, So I guess, here the emphasis is to sort of say, well, maybe there's some sort of social basis for like a non-clientelistic, those were places in some shanty town, in Caracas, probably they all, maybe they organized collectively, but they probably already had a very clientelistic type of relationship with local politicians in the, the COPE and the old kind of pre-Chavista political equilibrium in Venezuela. So that was a kind of natural way of operating. But I think, if you look at this Bolivian or this Peruvian case, it seems there's a sort of social change that kind of creates, a collectivity or an identity, which is perhaps a sort of underpinning of a much more public good type politics. So that's one way of saying. So I guess that's why doesn't the iron law of oligarchy apply here? Well, I think that's just not, I guess that's the claim. Yeah, that it creates more of a demand for public goods, if you like. That social change, that type of identity change, underpins a different kind of demand for a different way of doing politics.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much.
The N is small.
So there are a little bit more questions. We will wrap up. So just a reminder, we do have a Google forum, a Google group, where you can interact with the speaker if Jim would like us to go that road, or you can just forward email to him if you want and asking questions. Well, thank you very much. It was terrific. It was a great honor to have you here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we reconvene.
Thank you, Jens. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah. So we reconvene next week, and thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Cheerio.